If the past is prologue, there will be some students coming in momentarily, but I will get started anyway. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I am delighted to welcome you on this beautiful winter afternoon for a discussion of the future of American diplomacy. So I doubt anyone in the audience needs to have this particular subject framed for them, and it's particularly nice to have an audience with so many former and perhaps future diplomats present. In the last 3 years, we've seen things that I know I never could have imagined, and I pride myself on imagining all kinds of horrors. So we have seen one of our highest-ranking diplomats, our ambassador in Ukraine, targeted by associates of the president, surveilled, and ultimately driven from her post, and not once defended by the Secretary of State. We've seen our senior-most career professionals hounded from the Foreign Service en masse. The number 2 individual at our embassy in London just recently, one of our really experienced diplomats, fired for giving a speech in which he mentioned President Obama's name. We've seen appointments of such low quality that to very sensitive positions abroad and at home that they might have brought a smile to the face of Caligula, the emperor who wanted to make his horse a consul. Moreover, today, many of our critical diplomatic jobs remain unfilled. We have no ambassador in Afghanistan. We have no ambassador in Canada. We have no ambassador in the to the European Union, none in Japan, the Philippines, and of course, none in Ukraine. In addition, there are numerous senior positions at the Harry S. Truman Building in Washington, the home of the State Department. I was right, see? That remain unfilled. And in contrast with the practice that goes back decades, there is now not a single career Foreign Service officer who was a confirmed Assistant Secretary of State. As former Deputy Secretary Bill Burns, who visited us less than a year ago, has recently written, the evidence of rot within the State Department is pervasive. Historic decline in applications to the Foreign Service, unprecedented sidelining of professionals from senior roles in the department, a cacophony of scandals, abuse, and improprieties, morale that keeps finding new lows. Across the executive branch, the bureaucracy is increasingly beaten down, battered, and belittled. The irony in all of this is that if the impeachment hearings taught us anything, it is that we have some truly outstanding civil servants and military officers, and in particular, some truly gifted and inspired diplomats, men and women who serve far from the spotlight, who forego the great compensation of some of their peers, and who with intelligence and integrity devote themselves to serving the United States, protecting its people, and advancing our national interest. The tragedy is that they are not being allowed to do so as private interest trumps public good. Well, to discuss the state of America's diplomacy and its diplomats, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Eric Rubin. A member of the Foreign Service since 1985, Eric has been posted to many countries, including Honduras, Ukraine, yes, Ukraine, Russia twice, including as Deputy Chief of Mission, Chiang Mai, Thailand, where he was Consul General, and yes, Foreign Service officers on rare occasions get sent to paradise, and most recently, he served in Bulgaria, where he was ambassador from 2016 to 2019. In Washington, he's had many important positions, including as deputy spokesman at the National Security Council staff during the Clinton administration. That's where I got to know him. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the middle of the Obama years, where he handled such trouble-free accounts as Turkey and, yes, Ukraine. And during one brief respite, Eric Rubin was the Rusk Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Today, Ambassador Rubin is well qualified to speak to the subject of today's event because he is the president of the American Foreign Service Association, otherwise known as AFSA. I'm sure he will describe it better than I can, but AFSA is the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers. AFSA has many thousands of members and represents their interests to the administration, Congress, and the public. Most recently, AFSA has been in the headlines for the great support it has given to such diplomats as Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, Ambassador Bill Taylor, George Kent, and David Holmes, who would have had crushing legal bills from their involvement in the impeachment hearings, had it not been for AFSA. Eric and AFSA raised really significant sums of money to help out these heroes. And since I know that their testifying isn't over, I hope you will consider visiting the AFSA website and thinking what you can do to help our diplomats. I don't know if I'm actually forbidden by Dartmouth from making public appeals like that, but I've just done it. On a personal note, I'm really delighted Eric is here. As I mentioned, we've been friends for a long time, and I've been wanting to get him to campus for some years now. And I should add, by the way, that Eric is a graduate of the college at New Haven, and his wife was a college classmate of mine at what is sometimes called the Kremlin on the Charles. But in another demonstration that evolution leads sometimes not only to greater complexity, but also greater wisdom, he is the father of a Dartmouth 20, Rachel Rubin, who is here today. So Eric, it is wonderful to have you. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me just make sure this is on. Yep, it's great. Thank you all for coming. Good afternoon. I want to thank Dan and Tom and the entire team at the Dickey Center for this great invitation, for organizing a series of events, including today's talk. I'm really glad to be back on campus. And yes, there are many reasons, including I won't embarrass Rachel, who's here today, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to see her as well before she graduates in June. Let me just start out by saying I think Dan framed the questions that we're confronting very well, but I want to step back a little bit and talk about the challenges that are facing American diplomacy and American diplomats today. We, the American Foreign Service, are America's diplomats across 6 U.S. government agencies. At AFSA, we represent 17,000 members who are serving their country, plus our retiree members as well. And we have several here today, and I'm grateful for your joining us as well and for your support. This is a really challenging moment for American diplomacy, and I think stepping back to the big picture before we get into the specifics, I think it's important to note that this really is a different time, and I've just been spending time with students here today, some of whom are interested in going into the Foreign Service or other foreign affairs agencies or international affairs more generally. When I joined the Foreign Service in 1985, America ran the world, and we had been running the world since World War II. And we did a reasonably good job of it, I think, with some big mistakes like Vietnam, and we could get into that, but we probably don't have time. But the key point is, by the time I joined the Foreign Service in 1985, we had limited competition from the Soviet Union, which obviously had a big military and lots of nuclear weapons, but the Soviet Union was already failing and honestly was not serious competition in any real way other than occasional wars in peripheral areas. It was our post-World War II system. It was our leadership, and those of us who joined the Foreign Service at that time knew we were joining a service that really would be helping to lead the world through the international organizations, through our military alliances, and through America's role in really leading NATO, leading the Western Alliance, and really serving as the only clear beacon for progress in the world, again, with a lot of asterisks, with a lot of, I would say, honest acceptance that there were a lot of mistakes made, there were a lot of excesses in the Cold War, all those things I don't need to tell this audience about. They happened. But the key point I want to make is it was pretty much our world to run, to mess up if we failed, but to succeed if we succeeded. So that's over. And those of us who are still in the Foreign Service, who are still in the practice of diplomacy on behalf of our country, have the benefit of still representing the strongest and most influential country in the world, and there's no question that's what we are. But we really are no longer leading the world, for better or for worse. And the problem that we face, and this is a challenge that I discussed with the students today who are interested in becoming foreign service officers and becoming diplomats, is no one else is interested in playing that role either, at all, not even a little bit. And so the key challenge for those of us who are still in the business, but more importantly for the young people coming in, is to ensure that as we deal with the crises that are occurring around the globe at an ever-increasing rate, we do so with a commitment to active engagement, to spending resources, to sending people overseas, not, again, trying to recreate the unipolar world of 35 years ago when I joined the Foreign Service, but understanding that without us, there's not going to be leadership. China doesn't want to supplant that role. China has other objectives. Russia is in many ways a failing state with nuclear weapons, still strong in some respects, but never going to be a world leader. And sad to say, but in the course of my career, I have seen the end of Japanese, British, French, and German influence in the world. Not completely, but certainly not as leaders the way they were and could have been. So there we go, it's us. And this is a really important moment where those of us who believe in American leadership, but also believe that there's no alternative to it, need to make that case to the American public, to our elected leaders. We, from the point of view of our association, are doing so, but it's tough. And so the message I've been giving to the young people today is, your country needs you, the world needs you, because the world needs us. And that's not said with any arrogance or ignorance of some of the things we've gotten wrong over the years, and I personally count the Iraq War as one of them, and a big one. But still, this is that kind of moment. Unfortunately, we do not have the resources and the people that we need to rise to this challenge. And one of the things that I'm focused on right now, talking to members of Congress, talking to leaders in the administration, is the fact that we have a shrinking overseas presence. We have fewer people overseas than we've had in several decades. And this is at a time when we are no longer the only diplomatic game in town. So one thing that happened last year, which was mostly symbolic, but probably a little more than symbolic, was that for the first time since World War II, we are no longer the largest diplomatic presence in the world. We are number 2. China has more diplomats overseas than we do, and China has more embassies and consulates than we do. President Kennedy in 1962 established the principle of universal representation, the idea that we would have an embassy in every capital in the world with a few tiny exceptions, and we have. And we were the only country in the world that tried to do that, that committed to that, that did it. China's now doing it, and they've actually surpassed us by a little bit. In both these cases, we're not talking about a big gap, and we're still in almost every capital in the world. But I have a friend who's an Africanist who's worked in Africa most of his career, and he said when he joined the Foreign Service about the same time I did, the most important place in pretty much every African capital was the American embassy. And he said in many of the capitals of Africa now, the most important place is the Chinese embassy. And that's because the Chinese are providing aid, the Chinese are providing projects, the Chinese are not asking questions about human rights. And for even the publics in these countries, what they see is big projects with the Chinese flag on it. We're still doing fantastic things in Africa, for example, most importantly, almost single-handedly ending the scourge of HIV/AIDS in Africa, which is something that America did and should be very proud of. But there's no place to put a sticker on that. Whereas railways and roads and water projects and ports and airports have a lot of room for big flags and stickers, and that's what's going on. So this is a challenge for this generation, the new generation of American diplomats. We're no longer the only game in town, and we're facing real resource constraints. So I mentioned that we have fewer people overseas. One of our biggest concerns is that an increasing number of the members of our Foreign Service are based in the US. And most of them don't want to be. A lot of us have served parts of our career in Washington and have done so happily despite the high cost of living, et cetera. But people join the Foreign Service to join the Foreign Service. That's why they join. And increasingly, a larger and larger percentage of our positions are domestic. I believe this is for cost-saving purposes, and I think it's penny wise and pound foolish. But the most important recent development is that we have pulled a majority of our positions out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of us think that that's not a bad thing, that it was overdue, that we had a footprint in both places that was way too big, way too expensive, and not really accomplishing much, that couldn't be accomplished by a smaller number of people. But what should have happened when we removed those positions from Iraq and Afghanistan is those positions should have been sent back to other embassies and consulates around the world. And in many cases, they've been taken from other embassies and consulates around the world in the previous decade. I was involved in that decision. But instead, not a single one has been sent back out to the field. Every single position has gone back to Washington. Why is that? I honestly don't know and haven't been able to get an answer, but I think the best answer is that it costs 3 times as much to have a position overseas as it does to have one in Washington. Understood, but truth be told, it's not a whole lot of money in the scheme of things in the federal budget. And the real point is we're not able to get the job done across the board in a lot of countries around the world where we just don't have the people to do it. I've just come back from leading our embassy in Bulgaria, arguably not the most critical priority country for US foreign policy. I understand that, but still an important place and a pivotal place in terms of a lot of our interests in Southeastern Europe. And we had one officer handling energy, environment, economics, science and technology, who also served as the deputy chief of a combined political economic section and had all the supervisory responsibilities. And this isn't a place where our energy interests are critical. It's not possible for one person to do this. And that was one person out of about 89, 90 Americans. That isn't working. And at some other posts, it's even more critical. We also have an increasing shortage of experienced people. So a lot of our embassies are staffed by inadequately experienced people, not just the new people going out, but their supervisors. And we have posts, especially in the developing world, where our consular sections are being headed by first tour officers who've never done it before, and they're the only officer at post. And those of you who've been in the business know this is a recipe, frankly, for jail time, honestly. It is not possible to do that job properly without ever having had the experience working for someone else and learning the ropes. So we're badly understaffed and under-resourced. The administration for the 3rd year in a row has asked for massive cuts in the State Department and USAID and the Department of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture. What we've heard from Congress for the 3rd year in a row is that that budget request is dead on arrival, and we hope and expect that it is. And we hope and expect that for the 3rd year in a row, and it should be noted, the first year, it was a completely Republican Congress that rejected the budget and restored pretty much all of our funding. Now, obviously, it's a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. But that's been frankly, hard on morale and hard on people who are doing their best to address our national interest and objectives, and then are told, we want to cut your budget 30%. Anyone who's served in a bureaucracy knows 30% cut is essentially a death sentence. It doesn't sound like that if you haven't worked in a bureaucracy. You think, well, as long as they're not cutting 80 or 90%, we'll be okay. But that's not how bureaucracies work. I don't think that'll happen, and I think we have strong bipartisan support, which we work very hard to achieve on Capitol Hill. And I spend a lot of my time meeting with members and staff, working to build support for strong funding, for staffing. And we've had a lot of success. We have a new diplomacy caucus in the House of Representatives, which is bipartisan, and a new Foreign Service caucus in the Senate, which is bipartisan, headed by Senators Sullivan of Alaska, who was a former Assistant Secretary of State, and Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, who grew up in the Foreign Service and is the son of an ambassador. And they've been organizing their colleagues, and we really have support. So we're encouraged by that, but we need more resources. This is not about jobs for people. This is about trying to meet our national security objectives, and then our other big challenge is trying to convince our fellow citizens that this is value for money. And there are two pieces to that, both of which kind of go without saying, but they need to be said. One is the famous line from former Defense Secretary General Mattis, which is, if you don't provide enough money for diplomacy, then you're going to have to give me more money for ammunition. And it's rather simplistic, but it's also rather correct. There's diplomacy and there's war, and those are the two choices. There's really not a lot in between. You can try to combine all the things that we have to bring to bear, but at the end of the day, that's really important. The second point is, in terms of our interests, we've been making the point that our diplomats are our first line of defense. We have so many challenges around the world, from terrorism to health challenges. If you want to look at the coronavirus situation, it's our diplomats working together with CDC that are doing their best, and so far, I think, knock on wood, more or less successfully, to stop the spread through our borders. On things like the security of our food supply, it was our AFSA members, our diplomats, who stopped the screwworm scourge from moving up from Panama and Costa Rica through Mexico to infect American cattle as they had in the past. On counterterrorism, Dan knows way more about this than I did. It was our diplomats who lobbied the European Union and other countries to get agreement to have 100% name checks on every passenger flying to the US to make sure we knew who was coming, and that was against enormous opposition in Europe on privacy grounds and other things. So there's so many things that we're doing on a daily basis, together with advocating for American business, for American farm and industrial exports. And so making the case to the American people that for a very small amount of resources, we deliver a lot, is really the challenge that we have. I would say right now, we have that support on Capitol Hill, but we're facing a moment with the American people, which I personally have argued, and this is not original thought, a lot of scholars have written about this. In some ways, I think this is the end of the post-Cold War period. Right about now, it's taken 30 years. It's been a long, painful process of disengagement from, I would say, unipolar leadership in the world. But combined with the backlash against the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we are feeling a very strong wind, essentially saying we don't want to do this anymore and we don't want to pay for it anymore. And the challenge that we face is to say, a lot of us personally and certainly professionally agree that we don't want endless wars, that we made some serious mistakes in the past decade and a half, and also that we neither want nor are able to have a unipolar world with sole American leadership anymore. But walking away is a recipe for disaster for all of our interests, for our security, for our prosperity. And without overdoing the comparisons to the 1920s and 30s, it's fundamentally valid. It can be overdone, I recognize that. This is not the 1920s, but the idea that American isolationism, that American abandonment of key principles like free trade and free movement of people are threats to our future security and prosperity, I think are very strong. We've been through a bit of a crucible of fire in the past 6 months. Dan mentioned our colleagues who were called to testify before the Congress. This was a very painful period for a lot of us because it was really unprecedented. Our colleagues, and in my case, they're all pretty much all friends of long standing, were faced with a situation where the President of the United States, their boss under the Constitution, nobody argues about that, instructed them not to cooperate with the congressional hearings, and then the Congress delivered legally binding subpoenas. No one can remember a moment like that. It's a very terrible place to be in. And it was probably more terrible for our more junior colleagues, for our colleagues who are sort of mid-level Foreign Service people, who were note takers and control officers and people who were just witnesses to conversations. It wasn't easy for our more senior colleagues, but I think for them, they had a little more confidence and a little more standing. For everybody, though, it was pretty scary. And in every case, the advice that they got, which we helped them get, was you need good legal representation and you need to follow what your lawyer recommends. And in every case, the lawyers said a congressional subpoena trumps an instruction from the administration. And if you don't comply with the congressional subpoena, you're in contempt of Congress, and that is potentially a felony. And in every case, they took that advice. We worked really hard from the beginning to get them legal representation, and we faced a lot of obstacles. One of them, and a lot of this was things we didn't know until it happened. One of them was that until this situation, until this crisis, it was not allowed for federal employees to accept pro bono legal representation from a lawyer. And the reason was that under ethics rules, that was considered a gift of services. And gifts of services are limited to $330. And in many cases, we're talking here about tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. So one of the first things we did is go to bat for our people and get that changed. And we won a government-wide exemption from the Office of Government Ethics. Then we faced a situation where we wanted to raise money for them to help them pay legal fees, and it was not legal for them to accept it because, again, that was considered a gift of services. So with some help from very talented and sympathetic career government lawyers, we got that fixed, and we were able to raise a fund that we could then use to pay their lawyers on an anonymous basis, and we have raised almost $850,000 in the past 6 months, which is something we're very proud of, and we have paid every single existing legal bill of our colleagues. So that is due to the generosity of a lot of people, and I think there are some here, and I want to thank you if you are, because that is something that was just critically important to ensure not just that these particular colleagues were not destroyed by this, and I personally cared because they were my friends, but the message to everyone in government service and to anyone who might be considering government service who might say, could this happen to me? And the honest answer now has to be yes, not likely, but yes, it could. And then the second question is, and if it happens, am I going to be destroyed financially? Am I going to lose everything? And so we're able to say now, no, you won't, because your colleagues have your back, your union has your back, and we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's something we felt very, very strongly about, but we couldn't have done it without getting the rules changed. We also pushed the administration really hard to allow people to come testify on official government orders on official time. We got that, and also working with government lawyers, they agreed to pay partial legal fees for active duty State Department employees who had legal bills, only up to $300 an hour, which sounds like a lot, but sadly in Washington is probably maybe only a third of what one lawyer costs for this kind of thing. But nonetheless, that was the right thing, and we fought really hard for it. So this was a heavy lift, and then it cuts both ways. A lot of people, I've even had a few people in this room already tell me how impressed they were by our colleagues' testimony, how inspired they were. I've had a few students tell me today that they watched the hearings and decided this is something they might want to do, and that, of course, makes me very happy. But there's a backlash, and the backlash isn't over. And we're watching very carefully because there are a lot of people who see what happened as disloyalty, who see it as the deep state trying to contradict the elected president of the United States. Of course, my colleagues don't see it that way. They see that they were subpoenaed and they told the truth under oath, which is what they're required to do by law. There's also a federal law from the early 19th century that says that executive branch employees must provide Congress with information when requested under penalty of a felony prosecution. So this is serious business. But nonetheless, there are people who see this as disloyalty. There's also people who call our colleagues whistleblowers, and I would just like to make the point that they're not, and they don't want to be called that we did have a whistleblower in the intelligence community, and whistleblowers are important, and we deeply respect their courage, and they're protected under federal law. But in our case, our colleagues were just doing their jobs, and in every case, we're just witnesses, and got subpoenaed to tell what they saw and heard, and they were just doing their jobs as best they could. And so I think that's an important point as well, and it's an important point about defending the concept of career professional, non-political, nonpartisan service to the country, which is under some assault. And you'll see there are a couple of copies of our monthly magazine, the Foreign Service Journal, out on the table out front, and you're welcome to take one of those. And I wrote a column a couple months ago about this, asking, are we going back to the days of the 19th century of cronyism, of patronage, where political appointees got all the jobs, usually by paying money for them? Remembering that President Garfield was killed by a job seeker who wasn't happy with the job he was offered. And then we had the reforms that were spearheaded by Teddy Roosevelt when he was first in the New York State Legislature, then Civil Service Commissioner of the federal government, then Vice President and President of the United States, and the Pendleton Commission, and then the creation of the Career Foreign Service in 1924 with the Rogers Act. And all these were intended to professionalize the civil service, the foreign service, to avoid political influence, and to create a core of career, non-political people who would serve our elected leaders on a nonpartisan basis. And the question is, are we in danger of losing that? And what are the consequences if we do? So we're speaking up loudly about that. We have a situation, as Dan mentioned, where we have very few senior career people in senior positions of leadership. At the State Department, we have one. We have one Undersecretary of State who is a career officer. We have no Assistant Secretaries of State who are career officers out of about 25 positions. That has not happened probably since Woodrow Wilson or maybe earlier. And what this means is there's no career professionals with expertise feeding their advice to the political decision makers for their decision. This is at the same time that at the National Security Council at the White House, pretty much all of the career detailees, the people from the military, from the intelligence community, and from the State Department are not being replaced when their details end. And by this summer, we will have almost no career people at the National Security Council either. So we're facing a vacuum where there will be no career expertise feeding into key national security decisions. We think that's a mistake. It also has a serious effect on our career, and we are losing colleagues every day who choose to retire. Unfortunately, we're at the end of the baby boom, and I, like so many of my colleagues, have been eligible for retirement for about 15 years, and more than half of our colleagues are eligible for retirement. So people can just leave and take their retirement benefits. Thankfully, not everybody does. But if they can't get a decent assignment, if they can't get a decent job that's rewarding where they feel they can make a difference, then they probably will leave. And so we've had an accelerating departure of our senior people, which is a huge loss, not just because of the lack of their ability to contribute to the policy debates and all that, but they're also the mentors and the teachers for the next generation. And we're losing that, and that is going to hurt us going forward. So I've been doing everything I can to say to my colleagues, please stay, hang on. We need you, your country needs you, the next generation needs you. May not be easy, but we've got to have our country's best career professionals doing the diplomatic job that needs to be done. And I don't claim that diplomacy is particularly special. I mean, it's special in a way, but this is true of every aspect of our career professional, civil service, military, intelligence community. We need the best professionals who are not political, who are not getting a job because they donated money. I like to say, could you imagine if you were on an airplane and the pilot came on and said, "Good evening, folks. I should let you know that this is my first time flying an airplane, but I paid a lot of money for this chance because I've always wanted to do this. And luckily, I've got a co-pilot here in the cockpit who knows how to do this. So if he sees me messing up, he says he'll take over, and it should be okay. So I hope you have a good flight, and I'm really going to enjoy this. Have a good evening." Or if you're lying on the operating table and the surgeon says, "I've never done this before, but I paid a lot of money because it's really cool and I've always wanted to do an operation, but we've got other people here in the operating room who can take over if I don't know what I'm doing. So we're going to put you under now, have a nice time." And you could laugh about it, but it's kind of the same thing. Could you imagine if a campaign donor said, "I wanted to be the head of an aircraft carrier task force for a couple of years just because it sounds really cool"? So this is what we're facing now with political appointees. We have the highest percentage of political appointees serving as ambassadors in modern history. It was higher a year ago, it was in the 50%, 55% range. It's now down to about 47% of our ambassadors are political appointees. It's never been that high. The range is traditionally between about 25 to 33%. And there are real quality issues as well. We always have had some political appointees who didn't quite succeed in their positions in every administration. That needs to be said. But we have, honestly, real quality control issues going on right now. And we also have some of our political appointee ambassadors choosing to fire their career deputies, in some cases before they even give them a chance to show what they can do. And that's a real concern because we're losing the experience there. So we're raising the alarm on that on Capitol Hill. We're not against political appointees serving in the administration or as Assistant Secretary of State or as ambassadors. We've always had a balance. It frequently works very well. It's kind of how the system is supposed to work, but there needs to be a balance. The law, the Foreign Service Act of 1980, says that as a general rule, ambassadors should be career, and from time to time, the president may appoint non-career appointees, and in all cases, they should be fully qualified. That's what the law of the land says. We're saying, along with some other groups, including the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is our group of retired career ambassadors, the Congress really needs to do its job and scrub the nominations and insist that there be real qualifications and that people, actually I should stop and say the Foreign Service Act of 1980 says it is illegal to appoint someone as ambassador because they gave a donation to the campaign. It's in the law. But of course, that has been honored more in the breach than in reality. So these are some of the concerns that we're addressing. We have some other concerns I'd be glad to talk more about as well in the question and answer. One of them is we feel very strongly that the Foreign Service of the United States should represent the United States, and to do so, it needs to represent all of the United States and all the American people, which means it needs to look like the American people. And this has been something we've struggled with all through my career and going back earlier. And I'm sorry to say we're really failing. And it's a complicated question. I don't think we're failing due to malice or intentional prejudice. But in many cases, we're worse off than when I joined in 1985 in many categories of diversity. We're doing better on gender balance. That's the one big success story, but it's not that big. In the senior Foreign Service, our top ranks, which I'm part of, the senior Foreign Service now, this is a shocking thing to say, is 91% white and 63% male. So that's pretty bad. The mid-level and more junior ranks are better than that in almost all respects, but that can't be representative of the United States. That can't be how we should be showing our face to the world, and that can't be the best and brightest of our country. So this is something we're wrestling with. There are no easy answers. As I said, I don't think anyone really believes this is intentional, but it doesn't have to be intentional. If what you're doing is not working, then it's not working, and you got to address that. The final thing I'm saying is, I would like to say is for American diplomats right now, we're also dealing with a set of challenges that we didn't face even during the Cold War. And one of them is just the reality in the current situation of the cyber challenges and social media challenges and fake news challenges and the assault, not just from Russia, although as we've all heard in the past couple of weeks, there's no question the Russians are in our elections again in a big way, as they were in the Brexit referendum in Britain, and as they are in the Israeli elections, and as they are all over the world, manipulating and trying to, in my opinion, disorient and destabilize. But we're also dealing with other countries doing the same, and this is a set of challenges that is relatively new that we're not quite equipped for. I experienced this very much in Bulgaria, where we really were not staffed or equipped to respond to what was really a very serious Russian challenge. And they weren't trying to win, they were trying to keep us from winning, which is much easier and cheaper. And so one of the important things that I did see and feel good about during my time in Bulgaria is the fact that we have risen somewhat to the challenge, not so much on cyber and social media and all that, where we're really struggling, frankly, but just responding to the challenge of what the Russians have been doing, and to a lesser extent, other big powers like the Chinese. I tell the story in 2014, when I was still in Washington, I was responsible for our relations in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. And after the Russian invasion of Crimea, I was at a series of meetings in the White House Situation Room, and senior officials in the Obama administration said to our defense colleagues, we really need to respond to this in a way that shows our resolve. First thing we should do is get some ships into the Black Sea. And the answer came back, we don't have any ships in Europe. And we didn't have any ships in Europe, not a single one. They were all in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and maybe one or two in the Western Hemisphere. But we had pulled them out because we didn't see any point in having ships in Europe. So then the question came, well, can we at least move some tanks to the frontline states, to the Baltics, to Poland, to Romania? And the answer came back, we don't have any tanks in Europe. And in 2014, we didn't have any tanks in Europe. Today, we have tanks in Europe and we have ships in Europe. And this was I would say a psychological shift that I think has been one of the positive developments. The recognition that we've still got a job to do in NATO, and that our alliance with our European allies is critically important and needs to be defended. So that's something that I think, I think has been a positive development to negative circumstances. But the challenge is very strong, and for the next generation of diplomats, dealing with that, especially dealing with adversaries who don't have a code of conduct, who in the Russian case still believe in the fundamental Leninist principle that the ends justify the means, when we are very strictly governed by rules and regulations and laws and values and things that keep us from doing some things. So that's a real challenge that we're going to be facing in the next generation of diplomacy. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need resources to do that. One of the challenges we're facing right now is so many of our allies are distracted or dealing with their own internal problems. The UK is a good example, certainly Germany, Japan, France. So we can't go it alone. It's one of the things I think those of us in this business feel very strongly about, and building or rebuilding some of those alliances is really going to be the challenge in coming years. And the American people don't want us to go it alone. It's literally not an option anymore. So we've got to do that through partnerships and through building and rebuilding our alliances. I think I'll stop there, except to just add at the end that ultimately, despite all these challenges, I want to be clear that I'm optimistic about the future of our diplomacy. We have an enormous amount of deeply patriotic, talented people. You saw some of them in the congressional hearings. We've got a lot of people who've devoted their entire lives, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, under danger, under health risks, separating their families. And they keep doing it because they believe in it. They believe in the mission, which is serving our country and defending it, but also a larger mission of our role in the world. And I think we're going to get through this time. We still have a strong amount of bipartisan support for this, as evidenced by the continued funding. So I want to end on a positive note to say that I am hopeful about the future, but we're going to be navigating a very, very difficult time in the coming months and years. With that, thank you, and glad to continue. Thank you very much.
True diplomat ends on an optimistic note. Okay.
Have to.
Well, there are so many issues to discuss. Let me put a few balls in the court, and then we'll take it from there. So one question I have for you, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but I haven't seen any statistics about the extent to which the senior foreign service has been depleted in the last 3 years, and I was wondering if you have any numbers on that.
We do. So in terms of retirements, the rate was sharply up, particularly in the first 2 years of the Trump administration under Secretary Tillerson, where there was very clearly an effort to push people out. to reduce the numbers. And we have a provision in the Foreign Service Act that says that an ambassador returning from overseas has 90 days this is a career ambassador, has 90 days to get another assignment, or he or she has to retire. And in the first 2 years of this administration, that was used to push a lot of people out. And they were told either, that really sorry, we don't have a job for you, you should plan to retire, or if you'd like, you can do a declassification review of the Hillary Clinton emails, and maybe that assignment will carry you through the 90-day period. And a lot of people said, no, thank you. That's not something I want to do. But I have many personal friends and longstanding colleagues who either were pushed out or chose to retire under those circumstances. And then our overall attrition numbers are up. They're not reflected so much in the current statistics because thankfully this administration has started to promote people into the senior ranks. And so they are replenishing that, but the big difference is we've lost literally thousands of years, I would say probably thousands, at least hundreds, but I think probably thousands of years of experience that can't be recreated. And replacing somebody with 30, 35 years of experience with someone with 20 years of experience, it's still good to replace them. We need to move people up. We need to give people a chance to show what they can do, but we can't recreate what we've lost. And that is partly because there just aren't jobs. So traditionally, our most talented people would serve as ambassador 2, 3, 4 times. That was very common. That is pretty much unheard of today, impossible. There just aren't enough jobs. Or they would serve as Assistant Secretary of State, which is impossible now. There are none. And even the Deputy Assistant Secretary job. So this is leading to an increasing number of retirements. And then it's sort of a perfect storm. It's coinciding with the end of the baby boom. And you've got a lot of people in their late 50s and early 60s, and it's retirement time. So with all that happening, yes, and I personally am asking people, please stay, at least give it some time and let's see. We can't guarantee that this too shall pass soon, but we can't all walk away. It's really too critical for the country.
When you say that there are no jobs, is that just because so many of them have been taken by political appointees?
Or not filled.
Or not filled.
So you listed,
right,
and your list was not comprehensive, all the ambassadorships
It was
overseas.
meant to be indicative, right?
It's indicative.
Yes.
There are many more.
Yeah.
And in Washington, when I say there are no career people serving as Assistant Secretary of State out of the 25, 27 or so jobs, I'm not saying we have 25 or 27 political appointees. I think we have about 12 political appointees. And then all those other jobs haven't been filled in the 3 years of the administration. And we have acting assistant secretaries. And in some cases, those people are career, but it's not the same thing at all. First of all, they're doing 2 jobs usually, which almost guarantees lesser performance. But second of all, if you don't have the nomination from the president and the confirmation by the Senate, you don't have the clout and the standing with Congress, with other governments. But yeah, the key thing is the vacancies more than anything.
The Hill, no pressure from the Hill to fill more of these, or just too many other bonfires to deal with. What has been the storyline there, let's say, over this?
Well, there is some pressure, partly because we've been pushing and others have been pushing, and partly because I think there's just general consensus in Congress on this. Last year's appropriations legislation had hiring targets for all of the foreign affairs agencies, and they haven't all been met. But they basically ordered the administration to hire, and they have been hiring. Mm-hmm. So in all of our agencies in state and AID and agriculture and commerce, they're hiring new foreign service officers. Not enough. We don't think the numbers are enough, but that compares to 2 years in which there was a hiring freeze and no one was hired. But in terms of nominations for Senate confirmed positions, there has been some pressure from the Hill. I think it's building. We've had several members asking what they can do. And I think and I hope that there will be a little more of that. One of them is just this issue of vacant positions. We just can't get the job done. And we make the point, China doesn't have political appointee ambassadors who get their jobs because they give money to a campaign. And China does not have scores of vacant ambassadorial positions or assistant secretary equivalent positions. And I'm not picking on China, it just happens to be the other rising power in the world right now. This is true of every foreign service in the world. We just had a really good book presentation at our headquarters in Washington by two scholars from Princeton. One of them is Bob Hutchings, who I think you know, and they did a survey of the world's foreign ministries and looked at how they worked. And all of them have pros and cons, and in some ways we are better resourced than a lot of the world's foreign ministries, a lot of which are in financial difficulties right now. But in all cases, they didn't have vacancies. Their idea was an ambassador leaves and you replace the ambassador. That's a given. You have a job that's there for a reason. I think that's something, I think we'll just keep focusing attention on, but it's very hard, if you don't have an ambassador in a country, it's very hard to get taken seriously by the government.
Yeah, I've visited a number of posts where we've had sometimes 1, 2, 3 chargés in a row and not had an ambassador, and they put on a brave face, but it's extraordinarily demoralizing. It's really not putting our best foot forward. So it's important to underscore that Eric is still a Foreign Service officer and therefore may have some constraints on what he can or can't say, but I'll ask you the question anyway, and you can just say, not today, Dan. We had a Dartmouth alum who had spent between 3 and 4 decades in the intelligence community here just a few weeks ago, and he said privately that he expected that if there wasn't a noticeable change in the next election, that there would be a mass exodus from the intelligence community. Do you want to characterize morale in the Foreign Service and what might or might not happen if there isn't some road to Damascus moment or even change of party?
Right. So, yeah, I am covered by the Hatch Act and can't make any partisan statements about the election or the candidates. And I can't comment on morale in the intelligence community very much. I do have some friends, so I know a little bit.
That's okay. We'll stipulate to what our colleague said.
If we're talking about our agencies, the State Department, AID, Commerce, Agriculture, yes, there are real challenges to morale. And I would just say it's very complicated, which is a classic thing for diplomats to say. And some of it has to do with other factors, and one of them is the fact that, as I mentioned, the world is changing. We're no longer as dominant as we were, which in some ways makes it harder to be in our business and in some cases less fun. I would argue it also makes it more challenging and motivating because we really got to get our game up and fight for our interests and all that in a way that we didn't always have to. We've done a lot of coasting since the end of the Cold War, just saying we're America, people will come to us. We don't have to really work hard for our interests. So there's that, and that's a factor. But these issues like understaffing, I mean, if you're at an embassy and you're doing 3 jobs, that's going to affect your morale a lot, especially if it's for a long period. And that's only jobs that are existing. If you're in an embassy where the jobs were taken away 10 or 15 years ago to go to Iraq or Afghanistan and they're not coming back, and meanwhile, every year Congress puts new reporting requirements on the State Department, more mandatory reports and other things that make it very hard to do the core work that you're supposed to do, to get out and meet people and get a sense of the society and do reporting and analysis and deliver services to Americans overseas and all the other things that we're supposed to do. So that affects morale as well. We are understaffed and underfunded, there's no question. So that's a big factor. And then, I do think we did take a big hit on Iraq and Afghanistan. About a third of our colleagues served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm afraid that for many of them it was a demoralizing experience, either because they were in massive embassies and consulates that they weren't really able to leave for security reasons, and ended up just feeling like they were spending days communicating with other people in this massive embassy and not doing very much. But also because we're facing, as we did after Vietnam, the reality, and this is my personal opinion, I emphasize that very strongly, I'm not speaking either for my association or obviously for the US government, we're facing two failures, two really immense failures on the scale, I would argue, of Vietnam. And for people who devoted, in some cases, years of their lives, in some cases, lost colleagues. Every year on May 1st, we have our ceremony where we unveil the new names added to the plaques in the lobby of the State Department of our Foreign Service colleagues who have given their lives in the previous year, and we'll have a few more this year. So that's had an effect, frankly, on morale, as Vietnam did in its generation, there's no question. So yeah, there are a lot of things that I think have been factors, and then, you know, the Russians know what they're doing. So a lot of what they're doing is designed to confuse and distract and demoralize and destabilize, and this is stuff that they've honed for almost 100 years since the creation of the Cheka in 1919, and they're very good at it, and they do it to our people all over the world. So that's a factor we've all dealt with. You know, we have training in how to deal with it. A lot of us feel, you know, it shouldn't be that much of a problem, but I've seen people really get truly stressed, and not to mention what may or may not have happened in Cuba and China to our people, and whether or not what happened was an attack, a direct attack or something, there's no question that was a huge hit on morale as well. And we've been supporting our employees who felt that the State Department wasn't supporting them adequately as they pursued medical care and an investigation of what happened. So there are a lot of factors, and we've also been pushing all of our agencies to do more for their people. So we had a big fight last year over families with special needs kids, and we had some bureaucrats, really, some of them doctors, who were basically saying, you know, if there's anything wrong with one of your kids, you can't go overseas. Well, if you're in the Foreign Service and you can't go overseas, then that's basically the end of your career that you've, you know, pretty much devoted your life to. The second point was, why were they saying that? They were saying, well, because by definition, it's always better for kids with special needs to be in the US. Well, speaking as someone who knows a little bit about special needs kids personally, Washington is not a particularly good place to be with a special needs kid. There may be better places overseas. That may well not be true. So we made that case. We actually won that case. It was one of the areas we really went to bat for our colleagues, and we got a whole new agreement with the State Department, and that's fixed. But these are the kind of things that affect morale in a concrete way that we've been working on. Spousal employment. Almost everybody is in a two-career family these days if they're married, and supporting people so they can serve together, so that spouses can get jobs. There's not enough being done for that too. So we lose people because, you know, the spouse says, I can't do this anymore. Right. That's a fact.
So those of us who've spent lots of time in Europe or Japan have noted the paradox that the countries that were defeated in or really bore a lot of the brunt of World War II have far superior infrastructure to our own. And so there is sort of some rumbling in what I might describe as the foreign policy establishment about what we might do after a period that's been pretty destructive to the Foreign Service to rebuild it, reinvigorate it, and you know, sort of relaunch it for the 21st century. Should we be fortunate enough to get that opportunity in 2021, 2025, you name it. And you know, there are a number of ideas going around. One of them is to again have far greater intake of mid-career people, to have opportunities for people to come back to the Foreign Service, maybe to go at recruitment in a different way. I'm curious what kinds of ideas are circulating at AFSA.
That's great. Well, let me say, first of all, on the infrastructure point, I feel that very acutely because I've just come back from 3.5 years in Bulgaria, which is the poorest country in the European Union, and in many respects has better infrastructure than we do. And I'm here in Hanover, where 1 mile out of town you can't get a signal on AT&T, where the only way to get here from Manchester Airport is a $200 cab ride. So yeah.
And the problem is?
Right.
Yeah.
And I never had a place in Bulgaria I couldn't get 3 bars or more. So and cell phones in Bulgaria tend to cost about $12 a month. So because they have competition. So anyway, I'll stop ranting about that. But I do
Bulgaria
think,
didn't even see a lot of the war.
yeah, right. But let me say on the question you asked, we are working and we've gotten a lot of input from members of Congress and their staffs. One of the things they're saying is we need to modernize a little. Our founding document for now is the Foreign Service Act of 1980, which is 40 years old. And as I like to say, that act was negotiated in '79, which was only 6 years after the end of the rule that women had to resign from the Foreign Service if they got married, and only 7 years from the so-called Wives Directive that ended the practice of the wives, not spouses, but wives of Foreign Service officers being evaluated on their husbands' annual evaluations. And if their evaluations were not acceptable,
What a great idea.
then so this act was written with that as the most recent backdrop, and they've been pushing us on a lot of things. The new generation coming in, there's no question. I don't want to get into millennial cliches that are sometimes overdone, I think, but there is an expectation for more flexibility. There is an expectation for a little more rapid access to challenging work. We're still structured very much as an old-fashioned apprenticeship where you start at the bottom of the ladder and you slowly climb your way up, and each rung gets you new responsibility, hopefully, but meanwhile, you don't complain about it and you do what you're told. And that's not really working too well right now. I have a lot of people that I'm advising, and I just had a new officer, and he was unhappy about his first overseas assignment. And I said, well, your second one, you'll probably have a shot at getting something you're happier with, and certainly by your third assignment. And he said, my third assignment, that's 5 years from now. Basically, that's the end of history. And I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit. There is an impatience. There are other things we need to do to be more flexible to keep people. Retention is our biggest challenge right now. So we've had a rule that if you needed to take a year off, you could only take a year off. And if you had elderly parents or if you wanted to get a doctorate or whatever it was, the answer was no. You have to resign. Well, why is that? That's stupid. We invest a lot of money and time and training in people, and if they have a reason they want to take some time off, let them take the time off, and then come back. And in some cases, if it's a question of a degree program, which DoD does, let them come back with new skills and knowledge and experience. So we're working on that. We have a pilot program that the State Department has started that we've been encouraging, but there's a lot more. We do have a challenge. Our system is based on the military. It's what's called up or out, and the idea is you have to get promoted every certain number of years or you have to leave the service. And that is both important and also problematic. One of the things we have that Congress mandates is every year we have to basically fire 2% of our colleagues. It's called low ranking. And in reality, we're probably not actually letting 2% go, but it's close to that. And it's totally artificial. And we have a very carefully chosen group of people who compete in a very competitive process. And yeah, we have some failures and some people who need to leave and who don't succeed, but why 2%? And it could be 5% one year, but it could also be 0 one year, and it should be an objective process based on how people are actually performing. So that's something that we're working on. And as I said, things like 2 career families and special needs kids and also the needs of single employees who can have it very hard, especially in some of our smaller posts. So all this is about trying to keep people after spending a lot of money bringing them in and training them. these are all factors.
So you touched on something that's been an interest of mine for many years, and I'll just have this as my last question, which is particularly when you're on a campus like this one, where a significant part of the class will get jobs right out that are highly remunerative, and also that often, give a surprising amount of responsibility to young people. We have at the same time, a large number of students who are really eager to serve their nation, and they may be good for that first tour of stamping passports. But it's only natural that at their 5th college reunion or their 10th college reunion, they'll look at some of their classmates and wonder if they're being chumps, and whether or not their choices aren't disadvantaging them in ways that they shouldn't. We could talk about many colleagues and friends who we've had this argument with, and I've said, what about something more of a fast track in the State Department for the talented? No one's going to get rich at the State Department, but perhaps really bright folks could move a bit faster. And I usually get this is our tradition, this is our institution, this is how we do it. I did it, it's good enough for me, it'll be good enough for the next generation. What do you think about that, Eric?
Yeah, so there are several angles to that, and that's good food for thought. I would say on the question of competing with private sector jobs, this is a huge challenge because it's not just the money and the level of responsibility, but it's really hard to get into the federal government. It is competitive, but the competitive part is the least of it. It's the bureaucracy, it's the security clearance, the medical clearance, and then waiting for an opening. And then we had people last year who were given a job offer and quit their jobs and gave up their apartment leases and came down to Washington, and then were told, sorry, the government shut down, you can't start. That was not a good start to their careers. They all started, and it was okay, we didn't lose anybody, but that was just really demoralizing. I will say, you talk about college reunions, I go to mine every 5 years at the place
we compare notes every few years.
You called the College of New Haven, which is a traditional rival of Cambridge Community College.
Yeah, sorry.
And I will tell you, maybe the first 5 or 10 years there was some of that. What I've found in most of the past years, I just went to my 35th last year, people say, well, wow, it must be so great to be doing something bigger than yourself, to have a larger mission, to have something you can believe in. And I've had people say to me, I do this or I do that, and I make a lot of money, and I like it good enough, but it's not meaningful. And I'm okay with that. I've accepted that. My family, has a good income, but it must be so great to do something meaningful, which, I say to them effectively, yes, it usually is. There are times when it's so frustrating that it's not. But the question you ask, this is what I mean about modernizing. We do have a bit of a tradition-bound system, and it's partly because it's in the law. It can't be changed easily without going back to Congress and opening up the law. And there are people who are very nervous about opening up the Foreign Service Act because it's akin to calling a constitutional convention and opening up the U.S. Constitution. You never know what's going to happen if you do that. And that said, it's not the U.S. Constitution, and it has to be done. And we need to look at rewarding talent. I will speak very candidly, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, not either the government or our association. I think we made a mistake after 9/11 when we fought really hard to keep the visa function, to keep control over non-immigrant and immigrant visas when the new DHS wanted to take it from us. And instead, we got the worst of both worlds. We do all the work, but DHS gets to make the final decisions. Right. We no longer have the final decision authority. So my feeling is, given those circumstances, if we're not making the decisions, it probably would have been best if we had just given it up, because a good proportion of our new officers have to spend at least one tour doing consular work, which is good work. It's important work. I've done it. It's critical. It's our most important job, is taking care of American citizens overseas. And the visa function is important, but the way it's structured now, we're essentially contractors for DHS. And it would be better to let them do it, in my opinion, and have our people able to do something else from the start. So that's a discussion to have, very controversial. I have colleagues who will be furious if they read this transcript. But the other thing
They'll
is,
just have to watch it on YouTube.
or they
that
can
we
watch
won't
it
put
on
out a
YouTube.
transcript.
But then the other thing, and in terms of what you're talking about, is rewarding talent, is making sure that promotions match talent and achievements, and that people aren't stuck for years without a promotion. You know, the famous example was General Eisenhower, who I think was a major in the U.S. Army for like 13 years during the Depression, and there were no promotions available. He stayed, thankfully. But a lot of people won't if they don't have a sense that they can move up and move forward. So I think that's something, and that's not something we oppose. We don't agree with this is how it's always been, so this is how it has to be. That's not a good approach to anything.
The floor is open. Ambassador, what better person to start with?
Yes, I didn't have an opportunity.
Too many ambassadors.
Do we have two ambassadors here? Ambassador Hall, we'll get to you in 1 sec. Sorry.
First, a short comment pertaining to the recent question, then a question of my own. I was preparing a presentation recently on the effect of retirements and resignations on morale, and I asked a friend of mine who still does, when actually employed, work in the State Department, if he could give me a sense of how things were in the mid-levels. His response was, ask Eric Rubin. So I thank you for being here. I didn't know you were going to be here, but appreciate that you addressed that. I went back to him and said, I don't know if I'll see Eric. So what do you think? And since I'm not bound by the Hatch Act, I can tell his response, which was, with respect to Pompeo, they all hate him. So definitely seemed like morale is a serious problem. One that you touched on, this is my question, that you touched on but did not really talk about, there's a very serious challenge to the Foreign Service overseas, is risk aversion. Most of us who served in the Foreign Service see reaching out and working with contacts, working with the public as being central to what we do. But in the wake of the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and then the killing of Ambassador Stevens in Benghazi, it seems increasingly that the security tail is wagging the diplomatic dog, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, this has been a problem my whole career because, unfortunately, every few years we have a tragedy. We have, and I go back, I joined right around the time of the second or third, I can't remember, Beirut bombings. I think it is definitely a problem, but it's unevenly applied. So we have risk aversion in places that we shouldn't, and then we have people who are not being adequately protected because we don't have enough resources. And unfortunately, there's no rhyme or reason. So for example, we made a decision not after Benghazi and Ambassador Stevens, who was a friend of mine and who is truly, truly missed, but after the attack on our ambassador in Seoul in a hotel ballroom by a crazy South Korean with a knife, who almost killed him in 2016.
This was Mark Lippert, right?
It was Mark Lippert. We made a decision, and this was under the Obama administration, that henceforth every U.S. ambassador has to have full-time bodyguards at all times, which we definitely did not have before then. We had bodyguards in a lot of places, but they were places we had decided we needed bodyguards for the ambassador. And it's true that we went through a spate that in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, where we lost like 15 ambassadors and didn't have adequate security for ambassadors. So it's not a subject to take lightly, but nonetheless, we didn't need and don't need bodyguards for every U.S. ambassador in the world. And it's a huge reason because when you have bodyguards, you also have to have fully armored vehicles, which means we've had to order and ship around the world massive tank-like vehicles for all of our ambassadors, which, since they're the only such vehicles in any given capital, stand out like a sore thumb, and I would argue don't help security for the ambassador because it basically says this is the American ambassador.
Yeah.
But more importantly, so I experienced this, my daughter who's in the room can testify to it, in a place where I don't think it was truly necessary, at least not all the time, of having to have full-time security detail armed. We had a total of 9 people protecting me on shifts in Bulgaria without, any clear threat, except to say, yes, there's obviously a threat everywhere in the world. Yes, there is no low threat post, as we say. They're medium or higher now. That's true. But that's allocation of resources, massive resources. So that's the kind of thing that I think is a concern. But then your point goes the other way as well. We do have too many places where people are not easily able to get out and do their jobs. And it's a constant balance. It's hard. But the risk aversion is partly because of our legal culture. And people know that if something happens, they're going to be attacked and potentially prosecuted. And so the best solution in that sense is just to make sure nobody is at risk by not having people go out of the embassy. It's not to say we don't go out of the embassy anywhere in the world, and there are a lot of people doing great work and taking some risks. It also depends on who the individual security officers are and how much they're able to set a reasonable balance of risk aversion and getting the job done. But we're kind of unique in this. I mean, in Sofia, the only other ambassadors who had security were the Israeli ambassador and the Turkish ambassador. No one else out of about 85 ambassadors. And we are the United States. As I said, we do have some tragedies in our past, so you have to take it seriously. But it's not just the ambassadors, obviously. It's all of our staff. And it needs to be done on a more thoughtful basis.
Wouldn't you agree that it's less a legal issue than a political issue? We used to lose ambassadors, and it didn't cause internecine partisan warfare.
There's that, but then there is legal exposure. I mean, we have something called an accountability review board anytime that there is a tragedy overseas, and people get fired.
Yep.
Not probably prosecuted too often, but fired definitely. And I mean fired, not just reassigned, but that has happened in the past. So, it's hurting our ability to do the job. We need to get the balance to a better place, I think.
No, I'm not an ambassador, but I did have the pleasure of
Then
serving.
you don't get to ask a question.
I had the pleasure of serving as a country director for Peace Corps in West Africa and Ukraine in that period you were talking about.
Great.
And as you know, you become a member of the country team. You get very close to the embassy operations. And I just became very impressed by the State Department and the work that was being done. But one of the things I took away from the experience is I don't think the American people have enough understanding of what State Department does, whether it's citizen services or the cultural exchanges and I think this is something the State Department and perhaps your association could just do a better job, and I think it would make it easier to defend the important work that's so critical. So
Thanks.
thank you.
No, and I think the State Department could do a better job. We do the best we can as our small union and association, and I'm traveling around and we do videos on YouTube and talk to audiences, but it's hard, and we hear this a lot from Capitol Hill. I think the Foreign Service, all the agencies, but the State Department in particular, could do better. And one of the things I think is really important is to get the message out about what we do concretely. When you say, well, we help keep the peace and all that, it doesn't really mean a lot. But when you say we stopped the screwworm invasion from Central America that was going to kill all the cattle in Texas and devastate Texas agriculture, that's real. When we say we got the agreement with the European Union to ensure that we have passenger name records for every person flying to the United States before they get on the plane, which was a big diplomatic lift. That's real stuff. And then when we talk about citizen services and what we're doing for people, unfortunately, there's also the no free lunch question. So some of you may have read about unhappiness with American citizens in Wuhan about the evacuation. Well, one of the things they were most unhappy about is the State Department chartered planes to get them out of Wuhan and divided the cost of the charter among the passengers and said, basically, it's going to be $1,000 each to fly you back from Wuhan to the United States, which frankly is not an outrageous sum of money. And a lot of these people went on CNN and said, I am outraged, my government is not protecting me. Now, they didn't say, put up the cash or we're not taking you. They said, sign a promissory note. And when you go back to the US, we're going to expect you to pay. We're not expecting you to pay right now. Why exactly would the US taxpayer be expected to pay to fly American citizens out of Wuhan? And by the way, I suspect some of those American citizens complain about high taxes and welfare for people who are getting benefits they don't deserve. And all of a sudden they're saying, why should I have to pay $1,000? The State Department did all the work of arranging the flights. So this is the kind of thing we face, but it is partly not adequate. It's not an excuse. We've got to do a better job, I agree. When we go to reunions, and I went to my high school reunion last year, and you say to people, I work for the State Department, and they say, State Department of what? Motor vehicles? Really? Or you say, I'm in the Foreign Service, and they say, is that like the Foreign Legion? So these are, educated people. These are not, so we've got a job too. Partly we're very small. It's not a lot of people. Total of about 25,000 people, which in the scale of 2 million federal employees is nothing. And we don't have a natural lobby. We don't have a natural constituency. So we've got to work these constituencies, and I agree with you entirely. But I appreciate the kind words about our people overseas.
I would just add that the U.S. government's been trying to crack this nut for about 35 years, getting people to appreciate foreign engagement and the activities of our diplomats more. And someday you should look at the visit of Madeleine Albright and the late Sandy Berger, and was Bill Cohen there? I can't remember, to Columbus, Ohio.
Oh, no.
To try to explain engagement abroad and what this was all doing for Americans. They were basically pelted with rotten vegetables. It was one of the ugliest things you've ever seen. Do we have a question over here? No? Yes, we did. I knew I saw one. Yes.
You had AFSA there, and I'm wondering, since very recently the Trump administration has a lot of people in their crosshairs who may have said something, sung a ditty against Trump in their own shower or something like that. But I'm curious as to know if would AFSA or you could be in the crosshairs of the Trump administration here because you had helped fund the law, the legal bills of the people there.
Thanks. Well, the most important point to make is, unlike some federal unions in the civil service, we are scrupulously nonpartisan, non-political. We not only don't endorse candidates, but we will not say a single word in regard to an American election, in regard to the upcoming election. More importantly, we are pretty determined to promote the ideals of our profession and the concrete needs of our colleagues by sort of navigating these difficult political waters, and they are very difficult. So, I think 3 times about everything I say in interviews and in public. And yes, it's in the back of my mind that I have to be careful. Yes, that really is. And I should be. That's my job. I should be careful. On the other hand, we've got a job to do sticking up for our profession and our colleagues. And in the case of the impeachment, we knew what we had to do, but we did it in a way that was supporting them, not attacking anybody. So I can't guarantee that I know, I will actually say, I know there are people who are unhappy with us for having supported the people who testified, who are unhappy with us about criticizing things like the proposed funding levels and other things, and it's our job to criticize that. But we're careful, and we're professional, and we're nonpartisan. And that's what our members want too. I really haven't had any flack from our membership about, why aren't you getting more political or all that. That's not who we are. We've got to serve every administration Yeah, we're careful and we're watching it, and I understand what you're saying, but so far, knock on wood, yeah.
Okay. So, all the way in the back? Yeah.
Have you found that the profile of people who are applying to be career Foreign Service officers has changed since you've been in the Foreign Service?
I would say not, with one exception. We meet with every single new member of the Foreign Service in every one of our agencies, and we usually host them for lunch at our headquarters, and then don't let them leave till they sign a dues form, which is very effective. But they're a little older. We're getting, and this is anecdotal, I don't have hard numbers. We still do get people right out of college or shortly thereafter, and I was one of them. But we're getting a lot of second career people in their 30s and 40s, which I think is really good, because they bring real life work experience. And the difference compared to when I joined is now you get extra points on the exam for international experience, for foreign languages. And I would say this last class that we hosted for lunch, it was remarkable how deep their experience was. We had a bunch of former Peace Corps volunteers. We had a lot of Foreign Service spouses who had experience in the Foreign Service overseas, know what they're getting into, which is an important point. And a lot of people who were in their 30s and 40s, which I welcome. We do have a retirement age of 65, and we have a maximum entry age of 55 because of that retirement age. We don't get too many people in their 50s, but we're still getting, as I said, still getting people in their early 20s, but not like we used to, and I think it's a good thing. People who've lived and worked and studied overseas and have a better understanding of what that life is like and bring to it. So that would be my comment. The quality is still really high. I'm deeply impressed whenever I meet the people who are joining. So in that sense, I'm encouraged. But we need to hire more. What I'm not happy about is the numbers we're hiring, which is better than 2 years ago, but not good enough.
Very quickly, the last question. Thank you. Take the mic, please. Whoop. We want posterity to hear you.
Thank you. Is that working? Yes. I served for 28 years in the Foreign Service, and I'm proud to say a card-carrying member of AFSA.
Thank you.
And I thank you very much for being here. I also want to applaud the work that you, Mr. Benjamin, and the Dickey Center are doing in this regard, and I would like to encourage you to do even more and perhaps broaden it throughout the college. I'm also a graduate at Dartmouth, and at the time when I was here, and I think it was in large part a result of the efforts of President John Sloan Dickey, the college had a major in international relations. It was an interdepartmental major of government, what was called government in those days, political science really, economics and history. And in the senior year, we were all required to take a coordinating course. 5 of the members of my class joined the Foreign Service, 5 members. And I think that I would encourage AFSA and also you, Mr. Benjamin, and your organization to encourage that students here, more of them, to think about joining the Foreign Service.
Thank you very much. And I will tell you, I spent much of today meeting with students, and I'm about to go do that before dinner as well with undergraduates and talk to a lot of people who are interested. You gave me an opening, so I'm going to take it. I suspect there may be 1 or 2 political scientists in the room here today, so please don't consider this a call to arms, but the decline and fall of area studies is a disaster in political science, and it's hurting us too. The idea that we don't need specialists in regions and languages and the multidisciplinary study of countries and regions. And thankfully, we're starting to see a slight turnaround on Russia and Eastern Europe, which I know best, and it's happening here at Dartmouth too in terms of enrollment in Russian and in Russian and East European studies, and that's great. Some people think that may be because of Mr. Putin, which is good, but unfortunately, I've heard this now, and I apologize if there are people here in the field who will disagree with me, but I have friends in the field who say, you know, there is never these days going to be a tenure track position for an area studies person. And that's really too bad, because we need that. We need, obviously, sinologists, we need a Europeanist, we need Africanists. So that's my pitch. I know it's not falling on ears that can do anything about it, but it's a concern that I have, because we see that in the Foreign Service just a lot. I studied Russian in high school starting at the age of 16 in a public high school in New York with DoD money. DoD paid my high school to teach Russian, and DoD also paid Yale to teach me Russian. And that's long gone.
And you still didn't go into DoD?
I didn't, but more importantly, DoD is not paying anybody to teach Chinese.
Yeah. So
And that's a concern.
let me just say in closing, thanks for your remark. We would be having even more events for Ambassador Rubin if we hadn't had a recruiter from the State Department here just 2 weeks ago. There's great interest, and we at the Dickey Center are delighted to support that in every way we can by bringing lots of diplomats to visit and the like. And let me just say, I profoundly wish I had a nickel from every alum who did international relations who would like us to recreate the major. I'm going to point out Professor Valentino behind you, because he's actually in the department, and he's an international relations professor, and he has a say in these things. I'm just pushing the broom. So on that note, let me just say before I thank our guest, on Thursday, we'll have Ambassador Susan Rice, speaking of ambassadors, here speaking in Spalding on many of the same issues, in fact, in addition to those of her own life and her memoir, and I hope you can all join us. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, we're asking people to get tickets. They don't cost anything. You just have to get them. How do we get them again? I know that, but you just go to the Hop and get them? Or online. Okay, it's a new system. I'm sorry it'll confuse everyone, but please, it'll be a great event. Susan is one of the liveliest minds and speakers around. And with that, let me just close by thanking Ambassador Rubin for joining us here for a really terrific conversation.
Thank you.